Hello everyone, my name is Anthony Livernoy and thank you for watching my virtual debate. On August 6th and 9th of 1945, the US deployed the atomic weapons on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As time has passed, two distinct positions have developed on the necessity of the bomb, and many schools of thought have developed on the belief if the bomb even actually impacted the surrender of the Japanese Empire. I believe the use of these horrific weapons was not only directly impactful on the surrender of the Japanese Empire, but it was the best decision the US could have made at that time. It has been argued that the US could have worked with Japan and allowed them to save face, so to speak, while surrendering by acquiescing to some of their requirements. General Eisenhower was quoted as saying he believed the Japanese were already defeated and that the use of the bomb was unnecessary. It is also believed that Russia's declaration of war against Japan and their invasion of Manchuria shortly after the first bomb led to the surrender of Japan. However, it should be noted that many also argue that Russia only decided to join the war against Japan and invade Manchuria because the bomb was dropped, and therefore they were under the belief or the assumption that they would not have to actually invade the island. And this allowed them to save face on the world stage by saying, yes, we declared war on Japan, knowing they wouldn't have to lose that many Russian lives in the island invasion. Both of these pieces of evidence require a little bit of context, however. Specifically, that the US demanded a complete unconditional surrender of Japan, with the piece that was most disagreeable to Japan, the removal of their emperor. If the US would have compromised on this position, the Allied victory of World War II would have been tarnished, to say the least. The remaining leaders of the Axis powers were already gone, well, actually already dead. And if the leader of a country that was known worldwide as a brutal human rights violating, murdering regime was to be allowed to remain in power, then the legitimacy of the war would have been brought into question. While the destruction caused by the bombs may not have truly cowered the Japanese into surrender, especially considering that they've already endured numerous firebombing campaigns before the atomic bomb, the emperor did specifically mention the atomic bomb in his surrender speech. This may have provided the emperor the excuse he needed to surrender while still, so to speak, saving face on his part. And before Russia was able to invade the island with the US. Now, this brings me to my next point. The US wanted sole decision making in the post-World War II Japan. They did not want Russia involved in this whatsoever. There was already a growing distrust within the US leadership about communism and its potential spread around the world. Now, Japan also didn't want Russia involved either, as they were fearful of a communist uprising within their own country, especially with a weak post-war government that could potentially overthrow their form of government and instill a communist dictatorship on the island. Now, this would have possibly also presented an opportunity for Russia to further its influence into the Pacific Ocean and create more of a hostile stance towards the US. Now, if the US was to participate with Russia in the island invasion, there was no way we could have kept them out of the peace talks. And at best, this may have led to a German-style post-war where the USSR and the Allied powers were occupying parts of Germany, and at worst, possibly a full-on communist state of Japan. Such as the Warsaw Pact, Poland, the Iron Curtain, all through there. Now, this would have also allowed USSR to possibly surround Korea, which was next on our agenda, and we really would have been really hampered going into Korea with a communist state surrounding the whole peninsula. Not only did the bomb prevent this from happening, it also prevented the loss of Russian life, so in a way, it sort of helped them. Now, the US totally was not concerned about any kind of Russian life loss whatsoever, but the bomb did prevent those deaths. So you could look at it as a worldwide effect, how many lives it helped save. Which brings me to the next point. The main argument for the bomb is that it ultimately saved more lives than it took. Now, obtaining an unconditional surrender from Imperial Japan, sans bomb, would have required nearly the complete destruction of the Japanese military. For this to happen, the Allied forces would have had to invade the Japanese islands and take Tokyo. The Allied forces' planned invasion of the islands, known as Operation Downfall, made numerous assumptions, as all military operations do, through intelligence estimates, which we've been learning about. This is also pulled into the military, and then we make courses of actions. Now, these assumptions can be kind of on, or they could vary wildly. So in this case, I'm going to try to use the lowest case casualty numbers, so not to overinflate the whole idea. Now, the Japanese were estimated to have approximately 30 divisions, or a little over 30 divisions of fighting forces on the island when they were getting closer to the actual ending of the war. Up to 10,000 aircraft as well that could have wreaked havoc on naval assets as they're trying to invade the island. Secretary of War at the time, Henry Stimson, received varied estimates on U.S. casualties alone that range from 1.7 to 4 million soldiers, including 400 to 800,000 deaths. So there's, at a minimum of 400,000 deaths. No one can be sure of what these estimates would prove to be correct, but the total deaths attributed to the nuclear bombs being who were killed instantly, and then who died from radiation poisoning and the other effects of the bombs afterwards, totaled about 225,000 people. This is just slightly over half of the U.S. deaths that were estimated on the low end. Not to mention, the estimated casualties on the Japanese side would have been approximately 10 million. So if you were to use some just a little bit of logical deduction here and calculate some numbers based on U.S. casualties versus U.S. fatalities, those 10 million Japanese casualties on the low side could have attributed up to 2.5 million deaths, 2.3 million deaths alone. If the bomb was not dropped and the ground war was required in Japan, the total death and carnage of the war could have led up to, on a low side, up to 12 times the amount of deaths caused by the bombs alone. Both courses of actions would have included civilian casualties, including women and children. The Japanese, like most industrialized nations, their war machine centers, their factories, were located in high population areas where civilians live, women and children, and also non-combatants. By the way, this is also why Hiroshima and Nagasaki were selected, because they did have actually pretty important industrial or war-making machines within their cities. If the Japanese, or the Americans, before they dropped the bombs, blanketed the cities with warnings of the bomb coming. So what they did is they flew these campaigns where they dropped leaflets that warned of the bombs, the impending strikes. Now, if the Japanese believed them or not, that's a whole other story, as psychological warfare has occurred throughout all of history, and countries may or may not believe what's being dropped on their grounds or on their land. However, if we would have done an invasion of the island and we warned these cities beforehand, this may have totally had a complete opposite effect of what we desired, emboldening the Japanese, who were very strong nationalists, who were very proud of their country, and created even more civilian resistance to any kind of Allied invasion. To be assured, any such attempts would have met in detrimental disaster as far as how many civilians were killed. To make matters worse, Japan had already enlisted all citizens of fighting age, men and women, to help defend the homeland. So in addition to those 30 divisions I mentioned earlier, there were millions of additional Japanese who were originally tasked with just support operations, but given the order that should it be required, they would fight for their country in the defense of their island. Civilian casualties were not avoidable, and short of acquiescing to Japan's demand to allow their emperor to stay in place, there was no way to avoid a massive struggle, physical, violent struggle on the island. Considering Japan's unwillingness to agree to an unconditional surrender and the strategic goal of marginalizing the USSR in the Pacific Ocean post-war, the U.S. was left with no other choice but to use the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It may be debatable if the weapons actually created fear to drive the Japanese surrender, or if it gave them an excuse. Either way is up for debate in many schools. But either way, the bombs prevented the Allied forces from having to carry out Operation Downfall. And it prevented approximately 2.5 million additional deaths on the low end compared to the 225,000 deaths that were created by the bomb. The hasty surrender of Japan also prevented the USSR from imposing their will in the treaty process and a possible expansion of communism. This is why the U.S. was absolutely correct by choosing to use the atomic bomb on Japan, directly leading to their unconditional surrender and end of the war. Thank you for taking time to listen to my debate. Have a great day.